Wilson. Thanks for joining us once again on Kaleidoscope Ears.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to speak to you, man.
Stephen, it's been said that you are one of the hardest working musicians in rock music today. With all the projects you work on, including Porcupine Tree and Blackfield, as well as your solo material now, and your 5.1 surround projects for other bands, how do you find the time?
I try to work pretty much every day of my life. I try to do something creative. And I don't feel right unless I've done something every day that I can say has been a part of a creative process. So it's not something that I think about a lot. It's not something I'm conscious of. It's something that other people kind of say to me. You're a workaholic. You work a lot and all this stuff. And I just think, well, it doesn't feel like work a lot of the time. Making music is kind of a privilege and a gift, and so I guess that's the answer to your question. That I work all the time because I'm hardly conscious in a way of it being work at all.
Grace for Drowning was released last Monday, and you've been doing signings at record stores right around the UK. Are you finding there are still new fans discovering your music, or is the demographic the same? Is there any changes happening in that area?
I think it's definitely changed in the kind of interim period, because this time I'm getting a lot of kids, and the funny thing is a lot of the kids have got vinyl. They're not bringing me CDs to sign, they're bringing me vinyl to sign. And that was really fascinating to see that process of change over the last 3 or 4 years from, say an older generation of people bringing me CDs to a younger generation of people bringing me vinyl to sign. Obviously very encouraging from that point of view.
I purposely avoided reviews of the album over this week to have a completely unbiased experience on my first listen, and quite frankly it blew me away, more so than anything you've done since Fear of a Blank Planet. I haven't since found a single negative review so far either, so others have obviously felt the same as me. But because your musical style is so varied, do you ever release an album being concerned about the reaction, or is criticism not really a concern for you?
Well, I think anyone that tells you they don't care what other people think is probably kidding themselves too. It's one of those things that I think you have to make the music in a way, in a very selfish way, in a vacuum, in a sense, that you don't become distracted by what perhaps you might perceive people are expecting to hear from you. But at the same time, once you finish the music and you kind of release your baby into the world, as it were, I think it's only natural to want other people, to get approval from other people. Having said that, like you, I deliberately have avoided, as much as possible, trying to read reviews and things, because I do find them distracting. And I think it's human nature that you can read 20 reviews of your album that are glowing, and then you read one review that's very negative, and that's the one that kind of sticks in your mind, So and I think that's human nature. That we don't like the idea that anyone might not, like us or would dislike us. So, and those things are upsetting. So I think initially, certainly, I try and avoid any of that because it's quite distracting. But of course, I'm doing signing sessions this week, so people are coming up to me and telling me I like the new album, or I wasn't sure about the new album, and not everyone digs it, I think most people, at least, even if they don't like it or they don't get it, they kind of accept and admire the fact that it is quite an uncompromising and an intense listen. So it's not like people are saying that they think I've sold out or anything like that, but it's not to everyone's taste. But I think, like you, most of the people most of the people seem to think it's a very strong work, and I include myself in that. I think it's probably the strongest thing I've probably ever done, to be honest.
I have to agree with you 100%. But how does Grace for Drowning differ from your first solo album?
Well, the first solo record was very much rooted in the music that was happening when I was growing up, and I grew up in the 80s, and so I am in some ways a product of my youth, in the sense that the music that was going on around me was 80s music, and I particularly, at the time, like a lot of my friends, enjoyed the sort of so-called post-punk bands, So you had bands like Joy Division, The Cure, the Cocteau Twins, Pixies, those kind of bands. Then later on, the so-called shoegazer bands like My Bloody Valentine and Ride. And I loved all that stuff, you know. So that was the music that was going on around me when I was a kid, and all the music that all my friends were pretty much listening to. So my first solo album was kind of rooted in that era of music. This album, on the other hand, is very much rooted in the music that I went back and discovered as a kid. And you know, like a lot of young kids growing up at that time, I had, you know, friends who had big brothers, and I had my dad's record collection. So I was able to go back and discover music from an earlier era, specifically the early 70s, which was very much to become the kind of root of my musical DNA, if you like. And so this album has gone back to, I guess, the music that is my first love, which is the early 70s explosion of ambitious music, and the first generation of musicians that were combining rock music, classical music, and jazz music together to create what we now call progressive rock, but which, of course, no one called that at the time. No one called it progressive rock at the time. It was a new generation of musicians that were inspired by, you know, creating these new kind of musical hybrids, if you like, and in a way kind of picking it up from where the Beatles and the Beach Boys had left off with albums like Sgt. Pepper and Pet Sounds. And that was the music that I discovered going back in my childhood, going back to an earlier era, and it became, in a way, the most inspiring aspect for me. So that's really the main difference of these two records. One is very much rooted in my love of the 80s, and one is very much rooted in my love of the 70s. And I think you can hear that quite clearly.
Though, progressive music always, oftentimes there's a concept in the lyrics. Is there? I haven't actually had time to sit down and go through it word for word like I love to do with prog style records. Is there a concept in the lyrics of this one?
Not really, no. I mean, every song is for me, it has quite a significant, you know, sort of lyrical subject, and it's quite meaningful, and it's supposed to be, you know, something that does have substance to it. But the answer to your question is there isn't a strand that runs throughout the whole album. The album is about, you know, generally speaking, it's dealing with lyrical subjects that I've dealt with many times before. You know, the melancholia, breakup songs about serial killers and other strangely damaged people. So it's not exactly a smile fest. It's still quite a dark and melancholic record. But I don't think I've tried in any way to. Well, I know that I haven't tried in any way to sort of tie all the songs together, at least lyrically. Musically, I think they make for a very satisfying musical journey. You know, the sequencing is very important to me. The flow of the record is very important to me, as always is the case with me. But one thing I haven't tried to do this time is to create a lyrical narrative. Certainly,
you've had heaps of musicians from a lot of the classic prog bands as guests on your past albums. You've had Alex Lifeson from Rush. He was guesting on Fear of a Blank Planet. You've had, in your time on various albums, at least 4 different members of King Crimson, including Robert Fripp himself. And now, on this album, Steve Hackett from Genesis. How do you feel, as a fan of these bands yourself, to have them as guests on your records?
It's great for me. There's nothing more I love than to sit down with these guys and talk about their back catalogue and the albums that I grew up with, and sort of try and understand a little bit more about, you know, where they were coming from when they were making those records and what their influences were and some of the studio techniques they were using. And that's fantastic, you know, and Steve's someone I met a couple of years ago, and we've become, you know, pretty good friends, and I think the most important thing for me is that it is a kind of mutual thing. So although I am a complete fanboy of their stuff, you know, and and I, would willingly admit to, being obsessive about the music they made in their kind of peak years, as it were. There's also a sense of respect I think they have for what I do, in the sense of taking that legacy and trying to do something more contemporary with it. So, in many cases, these people are there's a kind of equality there, and that's important to me. And in fact, most of them I've also helped them with their musical stuff too. I've remixed a lot of the King Crimson albums in surround sound, so I've worked closely with Robert on that. And I've worked also with Steve recently on his stuff. So there's a kind of mutual exchange, if you like, of ideas. And of course, that's almost like a dream come true for me, because when I was listening to those records as a kid, it was almost something beyond my understanding of where this music came from and how these guys were thinking creatively. So it's been wonderful for me to try or to be able to kind of code a bit of that mystery, if you like, and I think you can probably hear on Grace for Drowning some of the things I have learned particularly from working with Robert on the Crimson catalogue, and being able to understand some of his creative motivations and some of the choices he made then, and how the records were made in terms of production and techniques, musical ideas. And that's definitely rubbed off on me, and I think it's one of the reasons why Grace is such a strong piece.
On your first solo album, you had, of course, Gavin Harrison as a guest musician. Was it a conscious decision this time to avoid that kind of previous project connection?
What I'll tell you is about this process is that I was very influenced particularly in the jazz aspect of the early 70s music. And it's something which, in some ways, has been erased from history. If you listen to almost any so-called modern or contemporary progressive music, or music that's made in the name of progressive, the word progressive, it's almost as if the jazz element, which was so important to the first generation of what we now call progressive bands, it's almost as if it's been forgotten. It's been 30 years now, people have been making neo-progressive rock or progressive metal or whatever you want to call it, the new kind of progressive forms. None of them acknowledge, to my knowledge anyway, the importance of jazz to the original progressive bands. And if you listen to bands like King Crimson, and you listen to bands like Yes, Jethro Tull, you're listening a lot of the time to jazz musicians playing, for the first time, playing and embracing popular music or rock music. And that's, I believe, one of the key ingredients for what makes that music so special. And this is one of the things I began to understand working on the Jethro Tull and the King Crimson remixes, particularly going inside that music, is understanding how much jazz was important to those musicians. So when I started to make Grace for Drowning, one of the first things I decided was I'm going to work with a jazz drummer. And I don't this time want to work with a rock drummer, because I kind of know what I'm going to get with a rock drummer. Rock drummers have a certain discipline about holding the groove together and being in service to the song. And jazz drummers don't think like that. Jazz drummers are almost soloing the whole time. So they're almost dragging the rest of the music along with them. And you have to go with the drummer. And the drummer is speeding up and slowing down. And that's a very, very, very different approach to the approach that a rock musician would take. And now I am a rock musician, so in a sense I wanted to bring in these jazz musicians to surprise me. And that's exactly what they did. So that I'm answering your question by saying one of the reasons I didn't use Gavin this time, because he's a rock drummer, and I wanted more of a jazz sensibility, not just from the drums, but also from some of the other instruments too. And I think that, again, is one of the fundamental things that makes this record different to previous records I've made.
Stephen, you've got no argument from me whatsoever in this particular aspect, but how do you think you get away with having such homages to classic prog without actually being labelled a plagiarist?
Yeah, I forget who said it, but there's a famous quote, something along the lines of, an amateur will borrow, a professional will steal. I'm paraphrasing now, but the idea behind the phrase is that I think if you have enough confidence in your own personality, that you can almost directly steal ideas, and by the time they've been filtered through your own musical personality, they just sound like you anyway. Now, I'll tell you something. Robert Fripp came to listen to the record. We did a big playback in a studio in London a few weeks ago for press and journalists and friends. And Robert came down, and I said to Robert beforehand, Robert, I've got to warn you, you are going to hear some pretty direct lifts from Crimson stuff. And he said, okay, so, smiled and sort of sat down and listened to it. And I said to him at the end of it, I said, Robert, what did you think about, the lifts from like Lizard and stuff like that? And he said, all he said to me was that he heard nothing of King Crimson, he only heard Steven Wilson. And that, for me, was the most flattering comment I had all day, because what it means is that it doesn't matter what I do, in a way, it still sounds like me. And that's kind of gives me a strength, in a way, because it means that I have the confidence now that I can, in a way, as you say, pay homage to some of these older records, whether it's from the 70s or the 80s. And I know that by the time it's gone through my kind of creative mentality, or whatever you want to call it, of course, people are still going to recognise the reference points, and I would want them to, but at the end of the day, they're still going to say, yeah, but it still sounds like Steven Wilson. So that, coming from Robert, that for me is kind of getting me off the hook in a way, But of course, you're supposed to recognise the reference points. I'm proud of the reference points, and some of them are quite obvious lifts, as you say. But I think at the end of the day, you'll also concede that it doesn't sound like King Crimson, it sounds like Steven Wilson. So that's the answer to the question, I guess.
And keep all the pieces in a metal tray.
The one track that stands out in contrast to the rest of the album is called Index. It's on the second CD. Can you tell me a little bit more about that track, and in particular, its obvious nod to Kraftwerk, unless I've got that completely wrong?
That track is a little bit different to the rest of the songs on the record, because it's more based in industrial music, and there's also elements of dub in there. It's more electronic, perhaps, than the rest of the record. It's quite, I think the thing you're probably picking up on with the Kraftwerk thing is it's quite robotic, and it's quite mechanical. And it's about a guy that basically takes the collecting mentality to the extreme. This kind of male thing with obsessive collecting and obsessive indexing and cataloguing, and and I have it, and a lot of people I know have it, particularly my friends have it with collecting records, This kind of collector mentality, when it goes to the extreme, can become quite destructive. And so the song is about, and it's sung and it's narrated by the collector extreme, the collector who even treats people as things to be collected, as things to add to his collection. And that kind of inability to empathize with other people because he sees them purely as objects for his own satisfaction. And of course, that's something which is very common in serial killers. Serial killers have this inability to empathize with the pain and suffering of other human beings. They see other people as merely things to be, playthings for them, effectively. So that collector mentality, when it kind of turns in on itself and becomes a very destructive element, is the subject matter of the song. And so the song is kind of delivered in a very kind of deadpan, mechanical fashion, and the music, I guess, kind of reflects that. So it does have a slightly more robotic sense, perhaps, than a lot of the music on the record. Most of the other music tends to be quite organic, and that's the exception, I guess. But I'm very proud of that song.
Alienation and detachment, the kind of themes that have popped up in various projects in the past. Now, the video for Index, in true Steven Wilson style, contains lots of creepy mannequins and dolls. What's your fascination with them?
That kind of feeling of detachment and alienation comes into a lot of the music, and Index particularly, as I've just described to you, this idea about somehow being disconnected from other people and unable to empathize with other people. So the mannequins in the video represent that in a way, the presence of humanity, but only in a kind of superficial way, in a kind of imitation way. And I think again the idea that a lot of these people who are very dysfunctional, they almost look at other human beings as objects, not as people. So it's that idea of representing the rest of the human race, if you like, as something removed from oneself, that sense of alienation or disconnection from the rest of humanity. And dolls and mannequins are, in a way, the best visual kind of metaphor for that, I think, in a way. Because they're supposed to be fake human beings, they're pretend human beings, they're replacements for humanity, but they're just plastic, they're just shells in a way.
So what's the story behind this album being tagged as two albums joined to form a double album? Were you going to produce them separately, or what was the story with that?
Because I think it all kind of belonged together. At the same time, I really don't like overlong albums, and I think one of the other things I'm very much conscious of is how most of the albums that I really love and I really consider to be classic albums come from the great vinyl era. And I don't think that's coincidence. I think there's been some great music made, since the CD and now the download era. But most albums these days, for me, they don't have the same sense of shape and sense of form and sense of continuity, or brevity for that matter. There's a lot of albums now that, because they can be 60, 70-minute long CDs, they are. And I think that's too much. I think it's no coincidence that so many of the classic albums come from the vinyl era, because 40 to 45 minutes seems to be the optimum length in terms of somebody listening being able to concentrate, engage with, and focus on a piece of music. Now we have albums that tend to be much longer than that, because CD has the potential for, and obviously there's no limit at all if you're downloading music. And I think that's not necessarily a good thing. So, with all that in mind, how do I present the music of Grace for Drowning? So we thought about maybe doing two separate albums a few months apart, but I didn't like that idea because in a way that would detract it from the whole scale of the project, So the idea came up, let's release the album, but let's split the music. Let's release all the music together, but let's split it into two individually sequenced records, effectively, and kind of promote the idea that the albums are not necessarily to be listened to back to back, but maybe two different albums for two different listening experiences, different days, different months, whenever you want to listen to the other one. Give them two different titles, and so in a way breaking the music down into more kind of palatable, shorter chunks, both coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, about the length of an old school vinyl LP.
So the style of Grace for Drowning being rooted in progressive rock, does that make it easier to tour live than it did Insurgentes?
This record has more of a sense of a band playing live in the studio anyway. In fact, a lot of the music was cut in exactly that way, actually having a band playing the music live. So there's already more of that sense of push and pull that you get with an organic live band performing. Having said that, there's still a lot of post-production going on and a lot of editing and a lot of overdubbing, and so it's not going to be easy, but it certainly, I think, is music that's more approachable from a live perspective than the first album was. But having said that, I am doing a few songs from the first album too on the forthcoming tour, but probably only about 4 or 5 from the first album, as we're doing almost all of the new record.
And finally, Stephen, in terms of the artwork, which is always very important in a progressive album, your collaboration with Lasse Hoyle seems stronger than ever before.
The more I'm left to my own devices, the more inspired I get by the kind of visual side of things too. And I'm always thinking in terms of visuals, particularly when I'm writing music in the very first days of a new piece. Almost as soon as I've got some notes and some melody and some lyrics, I'm almost straight away also thinking how, what would this be visually? How would this be represented in a sort of cinematic sense? So Lasse gets involved very early on. He's the first person really to hear a new song. If I write a song, if I have a demo of a new piece of music, the first person I play it to is Lasse, because I'm already thinking about the visual side of things, and he gets on board and comes back with some ideas, and that in turn can then influence the music to go a different way. So he's been a very important part, and he's always been an important part of the process, but I think even more so on this record, because also this record was conceived for high resolution Blu-ray release as well. So very early on we were thinking about it not just as a musical project, but as an audio-visual project, making films for as many of the songs as we could. And that's what we've done. We've released it as a CD, a vinyl, and a Blu-ray.
Well, good luck with the forthcoming tour. I know it's unlikely that you'll be in Australia in the short term, but rest assured there are lots and lots of fans here in Australia who are looking forward to seeing you the next time you visit. Stephen Wilson, thanks for talking with me once again.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to speak to you, mate.